The battle for hearts and minds in 1950s America raged on multiple fronts, with paranoia, power, and corruption shaping the national landscape. Senators like Joe McCarthy were fanning the flames of the Red Scare, launching witch hunts against communists at home, arresting politicians, judges, and activists in a fervor to root out the so-called enemy. His key enforcer, the sinister Roy Cohn, would later entangle himself with organized crime. Meanwhile, McCarthy's tangled web also ensnared figures like Robert F. Kennedy, who became so consumed by the hearings that McCarthy himself, fully aware of the farce he was orchestrating, had to reach out to Joseph Kennedy. McCarthy urged him to pull his son out, as Robert was taking the proceedings far too seriously. At that time, Joseph Kennedy was McCarthy's top financial backer, underscoring the toxic blend of politics, power, and influence. Simultaneously, other senators were setting their sights on the menace of organized crime and its grip on American society. They listened closely to voices like Henry Anslinger, the nation's narcotics agent czar, who warned of a vast syndicate controlling money laundering, gambling, and political corruption. This network, with its tendrils extending through prostitution, labor unions, and even Hollywood, was wielding immense power. Drug money was flowing into political campaigns, unions were manipulating the press, and mobsters like Meyer Lansky were raking in billions from Miami to New York, from Detroit to New Orleans. Lansky had become one of the most powerful crime figures in American history, a mastermind who orchestrated a seamless alliance between Jewish, Italian, and Irish crime families, creating a global criminal empire. Lansky wasn't just a gangster. He was a strategist, deeply immersed in the world of banking and finance. He had transformed himself into the face of organized crime's dealings with the legitimate financial world. He was the linchpin, negotiating funding for illicit operations while navigating the treacherous waters of American law enforcement, which had begun to zero in on his activities. He could see the tide turning. The days of prohibition-fueled violence and Depression-era chaos had passed. Now the media had a sharper focus, and men like Lansky were becoming infamous, their names splashed across headlines nationwide. The pressure from the press, the police and corrupt officials demanding ever higher payoffs, began to suffocate his operations. This rising heat drove Lansky to shift his focus abroad. Cuba became his promised land, with Havana at the center of his empire. He invested heavily in casinos and businesses across the island, transforming it into a mobster's paradise. Lansky, who hated gambling himself, bet everything on Cuba. He understood the island's politics and history, and he knew the immense influence he and his allies wielded. Beyond the casinos, he even offered services to the US government, sharing intelligence and forging covert partnerships with agencies like the CIA. But Lansky's foresight couldn't save him from the winds of revolution. A decade later, Fidel Castro's rise to power would topple Lansky's empire in Havana, forcing him to watch as his investments evaporated. The collapse of European empires, from the British to the French, further dismantled his offshore operations. What had once seemed unstoppable was now falling apart. The tide had turned on organized crime, and the law, media, and public were closing in. In the summer of 1950, the Miami Crime Commission took center stage, unveiling charts that exposed the scope of illegal gambling operations in Dade and Broward counties. No fewer than 32 gambling establishments thrived along the county lines between 1946 and 1950, with Lansky's casinos standing out as the most lucrative. His associates, men like Vincent Alo, also known as Jimmy Blue Eyes, William Bischoff, Lefty Clark, and his brother Jake Lansky, would soon become key players in his Havana empire, but the pressure was mounting. The National Racing Wire scandal, soon to be exposed, would push Lansky to take his empire overseas. Yet, his story is one of grand ambition, dangerous alliances, and ultimately shattered dreams. What had been meticulously built over decades crumbled in the face of revolution and reform. A stark reminder of the fragility of power, even in the shadowy world of organized crime. Senator Estes Kefauver, the chairman of the committee, opened the Miami session by explaining its purpose. He made it clear that while the committee had developed matters in Washington and other areas, they were now focusing on interstate transactions involving Florida. He emphasized that the committee was not a court. Its role was not to punish anyone, but to provide a comprehensive overview of the criminal issues they were investigating. It's important to remember that while we will present the big picture, the responsibility of handling local crime falls to local law enforcement and the citizens who want good government, he explained. Federal laws can't do much unless local people are willing to enforce them. We're here to assist law enforcement agencies, not to compete with them. He went on to describe the magnitude of the crime problem, stating that crime-related activities, including gambling, siphoned between $15 and $22 billion a year from the American people, far more than what the country was spending on its armed forces at the time. Kefauver then noted that these hearings were part of an ongoing investigation into organized crime in Dade and Broward counties. However, some key witnesses, such as Sam Cohen and others, could not be located at their usual residences or places of business. He reassured the public that these witnesses would be found and brought before the committee. Sam Cohen, for instance, had surgery recently and is in the hospital, but he has expressed his willingness to testify when he's able. The first person called to the stand was Walter Morris, a former grand jury foreman for Dade County in 1949. He was questioned by Rudolph Halley, the committee investigator. As Morris began speaking, it became clear that there was a considerable presence of criminal elements in the Miami and South Florida area during his time as foreman. It was hard to believe that crime could continue in such a widespread manner without some level of involvement or at least condonation from local law enforcement, Morris said thoughtfully. Crime was everywhere, particularly gambling operations, he continued. We found evidence that bookmaking was thriving in both Miami and Miami Beach. People could easily walk into well-appointed air-conditioned places to engage in card games, dice games, roulette, and of course, bookmaking. Morris also discussed how the numbers racket and bolita were flourishing in the area, with very little effort made to curb these illegal activities. He seemed almost resigned as he explained how these operations were happening openly, right under the noses of the police. It would be hard to imagine that such extensive gambling operations could exist without being part of a larger organized system, Morris remarked. He added that the evidence presented to the grand jury suggested that many of these criminal activities were orchestrated from outside the local area. We saw indications that criminal operations were often directed from other counties or even other states. When asked why the grand jury didn't indict the criminals they knew about, Morris sighed. It seemed pointless to go after small-time bookmakers who were just a tiny piece of a much larger puzzle. And unfortunately, we couldn't get to the bigger players, the ones who were really running the show. We tried for 6 months, but they were out of our reach. As Morris concluded his testimony, it became clear that the conditions he described had been going on for quite some time, with little change. The challenge of dealing with such well-organized criminal enterprises, especially those operating across state lines, was daunting, even for local law enforcement. The conversation between the committee and witnesses continued as Senator Lester Hunt inquired about the cooperation between law enforcement and the grand jury. He asked whether local officers brought information to the grand jury about the so-called big operators involved in gambling. Walter Morris, the former grand jury foreman, responded with a sigh. We didn't receive any information from them about the big-time operators. Unfortunately, they didn't provide us with that level of detail. Senator Hunt pressed further, asking which local official held the most responsibility for enforcing gambling and vice laws. Morris answered, "I'd say the sheriff does." Hunt then asked if the sheriff had appeared before the grand jury, to which Morris replied, "No, he didn't. For much of our time, I believe he was out of state, fishing." Senator Hunt confirmed, "The sheriff you're referring to is Sheriff Jimmy Millivan of Dade County." Morris nodded. "Yes, that's correct." Next, Judge Stanley Millage took the stand. He had been the state attorney in Dade County from 1913 to 1943 and had served as a circuit judge for the past 5 years. Halley asked if Millage had ever appointed private citizens as agents of the court to help gather evidence. Millage explained, "Yes, on one occasion. Some people came to me with an affidavit, along with photographs of a place at Miami Beach. It wasn't just a gambling establishment, but a relay station for bookmaking operations. Based on the affidavit, we issued a warrant, but there was doubt as to whether law enforcement would effectively serve it. So I appointed an Elliser to handle it." When asked about the result, Millage confirmed, "The warrant was served, and an indictment was found on the premises. However," he added, "the prosecution of that case wouldn't be in the circuit court, so after the warrant was returned to me, I handed it over to the Criminal Court of Record in Dade County." Halley pressed for more details. "Did they find a large number of telephones there?" Millage nodded. "Yes, they did, along with evidence of a bookmaking operation." When Halley asked if the case had gone to trial, Millage shook his head. "No, there has been no trial yet, despite the arrest being made around April 1949. Senator Kefauver interjected, "Is that kind of delay normal for this type of case?" Millage responded, "For a case like this, it's not unusual. If it were just a small-time bookmaker, then yes, it would be considered a longer than usual delay." Halley then asked, "Are you suggesting that in cases involving important lawbreakers, there's often a delay in the administration of justice in Dade County?" Millage acknowledged, "Yes, there are always difficulties. Sometimes it's the absence of witnesses, but there's often more to it." When asked if the police had cooperated with the Ellisers during the search warrant, Millage admitted, "There was hostility from the police officers involved. They didn't assist the Ellisers. They tried to hinder them." Kefauver was curious about Millage's overall opinion on the difficulties local law enforcement faced. "What's the real issue here, Judge Millage?" he asked. Millage explained, "There's a combination of technical difficulties and a lack of willingness. We often have the unfortunate situation where, at any given time, some officials want to enforce the laws, while others do not. It's hard to get everyone organized and on the same page." Kefauver pushed further. "Do you think the judiciary shares some of the blame for this?" Millage admitted, "Yes, in some cases. There's a certain fear of the power behind organized crime. People in elected positions, including judges, are often concerned about re-election and the influence of money from criminal rackets. They fear that antagonizing these groups could lead to large amounts of money being used against them in the next election." Senator Hunt, continuing the discussion, shifted the focus to the local perception of gambling's impact on the economy. "Do many people in this area still believe that gambling is good for business and prosperity?" he asked. Millage responded, "Yes, but not as many as we used to have. Perhaps 10 years ago, a majority of people thought that gambling was an economic necessity. But now, most people understand that it's actually an economic loss." Hunt agreed, noting, "We've seen figures showing that the profits from gambling in this area, estimated at around $15 million a year, don't stay in Florida. They go to syndicates in New York, Cleveland, Chicago, Los Angeles, and so on. If gambling were eliminated, that money could go into legitimate business channels." At this point, Daniel Sullivan, the operating director of the Crime Commission of Greater Miami, was called to the witness stand, continuing the inquiry into organized crime in South Florida. Daniel P. Sullivan, the operating director of the Crime Commission of Greater Miami, took the stand to explain the charts he had prepared, showing the known gangsters living and operating in Miami Beach, as well as in other parts of Dade and Broward counties. He began by tracing the bookie network that extended across state lines. In 1945 and 1946, while I was with the State Racing Commission, I investigated the wire service used for bookmaking, Sullivan explained. At that time, the service originated in Baltimore, Maryland, and ran all the way down through Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and into Florida, specifically Miami. Along this line, there were several drops where local distributors would collect the information and disseminate it to bookies. He paused, then continued. The primary distribution points were located at two places, one in Dade County at the Dade County News Dealers on Northwest First Court, across from the courthouse, and the other in Broward County at a place called The Farm. These locations received information via a drop wire and broadcast it locally through ticker systems. Sullivan described how the local distributor would lease wires from Western Union to connect bookies to the wire service. The setup allowed an announcer to broadcast information via a microphone, which was linked to multiple wires connected through the Western Union frame. This meant that bookies all over the area could receive the information simultaneously. He went on to explain that the farm in Broward County had been strategically established so that if Dade County authorities interrupted the service, the operation could continue from Broward County. By 1946, there were around 22 outlets for wire service in the Greater Miami area, but within a year, that number had exploded to between 120 and 125. Sullivan acknowledged that wire services had been made illegal in Florida by December 1949, but he noted that the identities of the individuals connected to operations such as the Colonial Inn, Club Greenacres, and Club Boheme would be covered in a later chart. He then turned to the major gambling operations in Broward County. The Colonial Inn was a significant gambling hub until it was closed in May 1948. The operation was controlled by Jake Lansky and his brother, Meyer Lansky, along with others like Joseph Adonis Dotto, also known as Joe Adonis, Vincent Allo, or Jimmy Blue Eyes, and several others. He explained that the Colonial Inn had originally been a joint venture between New York and Detroit gamblers. The Detroit group, led by Meyer Weil, Reuben Matthews, and Danny Sullivan, held about 32% interest. However, after 1946, the Detroit group's interest was absorbed by the New York operators. Sullivan linked the operations of the Colonial Inn to those at Club Greenacres, noting that 90% of the ownership was the same for both. The main source of income at Greenacres came from the crap game, which was controlled by William Bischoff, also known as Lefty Clark. Joe Massey from Detroit financed Bischoff. He then connected these operations to the Club Collins in Miami Beach. That club, located at 20th Street and Collins Avenue, was involved in a gambling operation until about 2 months ago. The key figures involved were Jack Friedlander from Newark, Joseph Massey from Detroit, William Bischoff, Trigger Mike Coppola from New York City, and Bonnie Cave, also from New York. Sullivan noted that Friedlander was not only involved in the Club Collins, but was also a partner in the Inland Club, a gambling house located in Sunny Isles in Dade County. That operation was controlled by Jack Friedlander, Samuel Cohen, Herbert Mannheim of Detroit, and Sam Gameboy Miller from Cleveland, Ohio. Moving forward, Sullivan highlighted the connections of other key figures, such as Frank Erickson and Bert Briggs, who each held a 5% interest in both the Club Greenacres and the Colonial Inn operations. Erickson, in particular, had extended his influence into Palm Beach County, where he controlled the gambling casino at the Boca Raton Club. Ericsson's operations in Dade County began at the Wofford Hotel in 1941, continued through 1946, and later moved to the Roney Plaza Hotel in 1948 for part of the season, and finally to the Boulevard Hotel from 1946 to 1950, Sullivan added. However, he explained that Ericsson's operations were not typical of Miami Beach hotel gambling concessions, which were usually leased out for amounts ranging from $2,500 to $50,000 per season. Sullivan concluded by mentioning testimony given in a circuit court case, which revealed that Frank Erickson had borrowed $25,000 from John Anoff, also known as John King of Cleveland, Ohio, to finance the construction of the Raleigh Hotel in Miami Beach. He also testified that at different times he had borrowed various sums of money from Jimmy Kelly, a well-known operator from Cleveland, Ohio. Kelly maintains his office in the Chester Building in Cleveland. Kelly was known to lend money to one or more individuals who had the privilege of establishing bookmaking operations within the hotels and the cabanas located outside the hotels. Erickson, however, did not have an interest in the gambling concessions within the Wofford Hotel. Instead, he used the hotel as a headquarters for his agents, which included Bert Briggs, L.A. Cantor, Frank Strader, and Jackie Zeldo. The Wofford Hotel served as the base for Ericsson's operations, handling large layoff bets or money received from locations such as New York, New Jersey, and possibly other areas. Some of this money was taken to racetracks and placed through the mutual machines, mainly for the purpose of laying off bets wagered on specific horses. The hotel essentially acted as the headquarters for Ericsson's racetrack activities, along with his agents. A similar situation existed at the Boulevard Hotel. Although the Roney Plaza Hotel was different, it operated as a gambling concession. This concession allowed the hotel to accept bets from customers inside the hotel and from those in the cabanas by the ocean. The same group operating the Colonial Inn also had ties to the operations of the Louisiana Mint Company. That company, run by Phil Castle and Jack Lansky of Broward County, was engaged in joint gambling ventures with others. Sullivan then put up the third chart, illustrating 3 hotels at Miami Beach: the Wofford Hotel, the Grand Hotel, and the Sands Hotel. These hotels were significant because of the people who frequented them, using them as meeting places for various operations. The history of the Wofford Hotel is rooted in a lease signed by Thomas Cassara and Neil Lang on November 1, 1940, for a 10-year period. Cassara, an attorney who graduated from the National Law School in Washington, D.C., had lived in New London, Connecticut, before coming to Miami. Lang, at the time, was the manager of the Raleigh Hotel in Miami Beach, where Cassara was also employed. According to a lawsuit later filed in circuit court, Lang claimed he had no interest in the Wofford Hotel's operations, stating he signed the lease merely as a favor to Cassara. Cassara ran the hotel for 1 year before entering into a contract with Abe Allenberg and Frank Erickson. According to the contract, Allenberg and Erickson agreed to invest $10,000 each into the hotel's operation. In 1940, Cassara, who had connections with Anthony Carfano, also known as Little Augie, secured a loan, but there was testimony indicating Carfano himself had no personal interest in the hotel. By 1941, Cassara left for Chicago, and Allenberg became the resident manager, with Max Marmerstein taking over as the primary operator. Marmerstein, a seasoned hotel operator, managed the Wofford Hotel from Cleveland. His telephones were removed in 1943 after they were discovered to be linked to gambling operations. The Chester Building, where his office was located, served as the headquarters for the Empire News Service, a known operation run by Mussie Wexler. By 1941, several figures, including Otto Lorenzen, a nephew of John Angersola, Abe Allenberg, and John Angersola himself, were named as partners in the hotel's operations. Interestingly, Anthony Carfano, though previously uninvolved, later signed correspondence from the hotel using the title Managing Director. The Wofford Hotel became a meeting place for notorious racketeers and gangsters from across the country, including Little Augie and his affiliates. Erickson, along with Bert Briggs, Al Cantor, Jackie Zeldo, and Frank Strader, used the hotel as their base for on-track gambling operations. This included private, high-stakes gambling games. Participants included Joe Massel of Detroit, Charles Fischetti of Chicago, Angelo Gyp DiCarlo of New Jersey, Alfred Big Al Polizzi, and others such as Trigger Mike Coppola of New York. In addition to these infamous individuals, regular visitors included Joe Adonis, Meyer Lansky, Vincent Arlo, better known as Jimmy Blue Eyes, Frank Costello, and figures from Cleveland like George Angasola and Tony Civetta. Other prominent attendees included Abner Longies Willman from Newark, Nick Delmore from Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Willie Moretti from Bergen County, New Jersey. These individuals frequented the Wofford Hotel, along with Youngstown, Ohio, connections like Joseph Jasper Aiello and Frank DeFilippo from New Jersey. One particularly notable figure was Joe Bernstein from Detroit. Bernstein, who was part owner of the lounge at the Albion Hotel in Miami Beach, was known to have connections to Mickey Cohen, a notorious gangster based in New York City. Telephone calls were traced from Cohen's phone to Bernstein's lounge. In 1949, Bernstein took over as manager of the Max Cohen Distributing Company, a beer distributorship in Miami. However, after incurring debts between $7,000 and $8,000, he fled to California to join his brother Izzy Bernstein, who owned a string of racehorses on the West Coast. Joe Bernstein returned to Miami Beach for the following season. Vincent Alo, a prominent figure in the gambling world, resided at 1248 Monroe Street in Hollywood, Florida. He operated the Chatterbox nightclub near New Brunswick, New Jersey, in partnership with Angelo Gyp DiCarlo, another infamous gambling operator. DiCarlo also co-owned the De Riga Trading Corporation with William Fats Riga. The company owned a large sub-chaser, which had been converted into a refrigerated fishing boat in Miami Beach 2 years prior. The two men, along with Frank DeFilippo, were involved in this venture. The Wofford Hotel's operations were closely tied to those of the Grand Hotel, particularly through the involvement of John Angasola of Cleveland. Angasola, along with his brother Fred and Benny Street, signed a lease on the Grand Hotel in 1944. Thomas Cassara, who had previously operated the Grand Hotel, was also connected to the Wofford Hotel. He owned the Grand Hotel until 1937, when he sold it, only to later lease nightclubs associated with the property. In 1940, Cassara signed a 5-year lease with the Angasola brothers. But by 1941, the same year he left the Wofford Hotel, Cassara withdrew from the nightclub operations. These nightclubs, which had struggled financially, remained closed for several years, although one, Chez Paris, was reopened recently as a strip club. The lease on the Grand Hotel, although in the name of Thomas Cassara and Fred Angasola, did not reflect the true ownership of all the parties involved. In 1944, in connection with the 5-year lease given to Fred Angasola and Benny Street, a deposit of $28,000 was required. $15,000 of this amount was provided by Benny Street, and $16,500 was put up by Joey Massey, whose name does not appear on the official record as having any interest in the hotel. Afterward, Joe Massey took up residence in the penthouse of the Grand Hotel. More recently, he's been living in a newly constructed home at 520 Lakeview Drive in Miami Beach. In 1944, Dave Glass, a numbers operator and horsebook operator from Philadelphia, joined Benny Street, also a horsebook operator, in taking over the lease on the Sands Hotel. This lease required a $90,000 deposit in rent money. The lease was signed and the hotel has been operated by these two men since that time, with Dave Glass personally operating a gambling concession at the hotel. The Sands Hotel soon became a gathering place for a group of gamblers, racketeers, and gangsters from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, led by Nig Rosen. This group had taken over gambling operations and concessions at several hotels in Miami Beach, but used the Sands Hotel as their headquarters. Associated with them at the Sands Hotel was Jack Friedlander of Newark, New Jersey, and Marco Reginelli of Camden, New Jersey, also known as the Little Guy. William Moretti, alias Willie Moore, from Bergen County, New Jersey, was also frequently at the hotel with Nig Rosen. In February 1949, the wire service in the Miami Beach area was cut off. On the Sunday following the shutoff, there was a meeting at the Sands Hotel, attended by Marco Reginelli, Nig Rosen, and a few others from the same mob. The history and connections of this gang are outlined in a letter from the Philadelphia Police Department, dated July 19, 1949, written by Frank Richardson, the Assistant Superintendent of Police commanding the Detective Division. The letter details the gang's operations and their history in the Philadelphia area, starting from the early 1920s during Prohibition, when they established themselves as bootleggers and rum runners. One of the people connected to the Sands Hotel, as noted by hotel employees, was Alfred Big Al Polizzi from Cleveland, Ohio. Polizzi, who has a known criminal record, moved to the Miami area in recent years and is now involved in the construction business. Despite his current occupation, he has maintained connections with figures like Little Augie, Pisano, and others who frequented the Wofford Hotel. Polizzi is also the owner of the yacht Wood Duck, which is anchored at the Miami Beach boat slips. This yacht, registered under Coast Guard number 41J198, was previously owned by Arthur McBride of Cleveland, Ohio, the former owner of the Continental Press Wire Service. McBride transferred ownership of the boat to Fred Angersola, alias Fred King, in July 1940. After several ownership changes, the boat was ultimately sold to Alfred Polizzi by Amy King, the wife of John King, on June 3, 1944. Polizzi's association with John Angersola is further reflected in a real estate transaction recorded in Dade County, which shows that certain lots in the Riviera section of Coral Gables were jointly held by John and Amy Angersola and Alfred and Philomena Polizzi. In addition to his yacht, Polizzi owns several other properties in the Coral Gables area. On July 29, 1946, Arthur Mickey McBride and Alfred Polizzi jointly acquired the entire subdivision known as University Estates in Coral Gables from Mildred Pafford, George Newsom, Mary Newsom, Harry Shank, and Goldie Shank. Polizzi's criminal connections extend beyond real estate. In 1939, a major investigation into the numbers racket was conducted by the Cleveland Police Department, which resulted in the indictment of 19 individuals. Among those indicted were John Angersola, George or Fred Angersola, and another individual named Scuria, who fled to Mexico. 6 of the indicted individuals, including the Angersola brothers, used the Wood Duck yacht to flee from Cleveland, navigating the Great Lakes and passing through the inland waterways to Miami. In 1941, the case went to trial, and the Angersola brothers were acquitted. This investigation focused on extortion connected to the numbers racket, particularly involving the African American community. There has been a close connection between the patrons and associates of both the Wofford Hotel and the Grand Hotel. The Grand Hotel, located on 23rd Street, is only 2 blocks from the Wofford Hotel, and many of the same individuals who frequented the Wofford also visited the Grand. The area around the Grand Hotel became nationally known as a meeting place for some of the most notorious racketeers and gangsters in the United States. Joe Massey, for example, has spent the majority of the past 10 years in Miami Beach. His interests are reflected in his involvement in the lease of the Grand Hotel, and his ownership of the home at 520 Lakeview Drive demonstrates his substantial financial resources. Additionally, he is one-half owner of the Miami Provision Company, an exclusive provisioning company in Miami. Massey is also connected to Tony Accardo, a prominent figure from Chicago. Accardo's brother, Martin Accardo, resides at 1217 Granada Avenue in Coral Gables, and Tony Accardo is the owner of a yacht named Clarijo, which is stored at the Miami Beach boat slips. This boat is registered in River Forest, Illinois. Several years ago, Joe Massey made arrangements for the rental of this boat slip, stating at the time that he was doing so on behalf of his partner from Chicago, Tony Accardo. Since then, the boat has been used by Harry Russo of Chicago for fishing trips and other pleasure activities. It is likely that further testimony will reveal connections between this boat, Harry Russo's residence, and George Bowers, one of the operators of the Sunny Isles Casino in Sunny Isles, Florida. Louis Ricciardi, another individual involved, has a lengthy criminal record, including multiple arrests for drug violations, 4 charges of murder, and numerous counts of armed robbery. His residence at 9166 Harding Avenue in Surfside has also been identified. It's important to clarify that while the chart shows definite connections between certain hotel operations and various groups, it does not mean that all these individuals can be neatly tied together as part of a single organization. The relationships between these people are complex, and their associations may not always fit into a clear, unified block. My investigations, as reflected by my testimony, have shown that there is a community of interests between 5 groups, and an overlapping of operations both in gambling and legitimate business, which is quite difficult to trace. The geographical origin of a particular individual does not necessarily mean they remain tied to the people from the town they came from. This has been particularly evident in Miami, where we see a mix of people involved in both legitimate businesses and rackets. These individuals come from places like St. Paul, Minneapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, Akron, Buffalo, Boston, Providence, New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and almost every large town east of the Mississippi River. Their connections surface at different times in different operations with various individuals. For instance, Fred Angasola is shown as the operator and lessee of the Grand Hotel, while his brother John Angasola is involved with the Wofford Hotel. However, the Wofford Hotel itself is a mix of individuals from Cleveland and New York City. The people participating in gambling activities at the Wofford come from places like New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, Providence, New Jersey, Cleveland, and other cities. This pattern persists throughout our investigations. While there may be a common enterprise like gambling, these individuals maintain their own distinct interests, regardless of their geographical location. In the case of gambling in Broward County, it appears that the major gambling activities have been controlled primarily by a group of New York racketeers, excluding those from Chicago, Detroit, and other cities. Meanwhile, in the Miami area, gambling has largely been controlled by local operators, though in the past year or two, this has begun to shift. Legitimate business interests, however, tend to overlap between individuals and operations. For example, at the Martinique Hotel in Miami Beach, Isidore Blumenfield, also known as Kid Can, has been named by various sources as a significant owner of that property. The real estate on which the Martinique Hotel stands is owned by a corporation, and the lots south of the hotel are also owned by the same corporation. One of the principal officers of this corporation is Ed Berman from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Ed Berman is one of 3 brothers, Edward Berman, Dave Berman, and Charles Berman. Edward Berman has a criminal record, having been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison in 1933 for conspiracy related to a kidnapping charge. Dave Berman also has a long criminal history, with multiple arrests and a conviction that landed him in Sing Sing prison in 1927. Their brother Charles, who goes by the alias Chick Berman, is involved in gambling concessions in Miami Beach and was frequently seen at the Club Boheme and Club Green Acres in Broward County this past season. The Martinique Hotel opened in 1946, just after World War II. The gambling concession at this hotel was taken over by a New Yorker named Julius Kramer, who is also known by the aliases Julius Steele and Julius Berman. In Miami Beach, he is commonly referred to as Jules Beeman. His criminal record, which dates back to 1924, includes numerous arrests for grand larceny, felonious assault, and drug violations. After taking control of the gambling concession, Beeman was called to testify as a material witness in a federal inquiry into narcotics operations in the area. Over the past year or so, he has also become a partner in the Little Syndicate, a gambling syndicate in Miami Beach. This syndicate has been controlled by two gamblers, Sammy Clark and Harris Levinson, but recently, Jules Beeman has emerged as one of its principal owners. In examining the real estate records of Dade County, we found that Isidore Blumenfeld, along with Ed Berman and Blumenfeld's brothers, Harry and Yiddy Bloom, were involved in the acquisition of significant property holdings in the greater Miami area. They were joined by Abe Brownstein, his wife Emma, S.I. Birnbaum, his wife Bertha Birnbaum, and S.W. and Leroy Feldman, all from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Their joint or partial ownership includes properties like the LaBelle Apartments at 344 Euclid Avenue in Miami Beach, the Hollingsworth Apartment at 1641 Pennsylvania Avenue, the Tamiami Hotel at Northwest 2nd Avenue, and Flagler Street, the Martinique Hotel, and several undeveloped lots on Byron Avenue in Miami Beach. In addition to this, our investigation uncovered extensive oceanfront property ownership by members of the S&G Syndicate, as well as other prominent figures in Miami Beach. Investigations previously led by Melvin Richard, currently a city councilman, revealed that the S&G Syndicate had acquired prime oceanfront property extending from the Firestone Estate at 43rd Street in Miami Beach up to and beyond 62nd Street. Among the property owners were Harold Salvi, Charles Friedman, Sam Cohen, Jules Levitt, Virginia Levitt, Sam Friedman, Samuel Haas, a retired criminal lawyer from Cleveland, and Thomas McGinty, who operated the Mounds Club in Cleveland. They own some of the most valuable, non-commercial real estate in Miami Beach. Further investigations into the ownership of oceanfront property south of Palm Beach in Lake Worth, Florida, revealed that the Palm Beach Ambassador Hotel was owned by Samuel Haas. The Bernstein brothers, a construction company from Cleveland, built that hotel. One of the officers in that company, Fallard Rowan, was linked to telephone calls originating from the West Coast, likely from Mickey Cohen, a known gambling operator. Another notable figure is Edward Strong, a former racetrack owner in Ohio and a major stockholder in the Detroit racetrack. Strong is associated with Arthur McBride of Cleveland in several business ventures and was found to own a substantial amount of property in Palm Beach. On May 23, 1950, 2 lawsuits were filed in the Circuit Court of Dade County requesting the rezoning of property north of the Firestone Estate. The properties owned by members of the S&G Syndicate were part of the suits filed by Harold Salvi and Thomas McGinty. Their goal was to change the zoning from residential to hotel and apartment usage, which would increase the value of the properties by 300% to 400%, leading to significant financial gains if the zoning changes were approved. The involvement of racketeers in legitimate business ventures extends to the ownership of Lyric, a wired music organization in Miami Beach. The majority of the stock in this company is owned by Benny Kay, who was also connected to gambling operations at the Club Collins on Collins Avenue. On February 27, 1950, during an investigation into illegal telephone installations at gambling locations in Miami Beach, we found 2 men, Melvin Ziegler and Lawrence A. Bridis, driving a 1941 Buick Club Coupe. They were observed retrieving telephone equipment from a Miami Beach telephone company truck. This occurred behind Lincoln Road, and the 2 men spent about 15 to 20 minutes removing a large amount of equipment from the truck. The secret installation of telephone wires, which was discovered during this investigation, indicates a more extensive operation than initially thought. The initial information from our inquiry indicated that these men were installing and removing telephones from bookmaking establishments in Miami Beach. During the course of surveillance, investigators observed them entering various hotels and cabana locations with telephone instruments, wires, and other telephone equipment, and then returning with different equipment, which appeared to have been replaced. Since then, we've received further information and are now investigating the purchase agreement for certain sound equipment used to transmit information illegally by wire. This equipment can be connected to either a telephone wire or a power line and allows communications to be sent over those lines via carrier current, with signals being picked up within a 12 to 15-mile radius. Afternoon session. The committee. The committee will come to order. Mr. Sullivan, will you return to the stand? Mr. Sullivan. Yes, sir. The committee. All right, Mr. Sullivan, please continue with your testimony. Mr. Sullivan. Regarding the oceanfront lots. I testified about earlier. Those lots were valued at $800 to $1,000 per front foot a year ago. With the current zoning changes, the value has dropped by approximately 4%, bringing the price to between $3,750 and $4,000 per front foot. I'd like to conclude by stating that the primary gambling operations in Dade County are largely limited to horse bookmaking, and the major operations are controlled by the S&G syndicate. The members of this syndicate include Jules Levitt, Sam Cohen, Charles Friedman, Harold Salvi, Eddie Rosenbaum, and Harry Russell. Russell has only been a member for about the last 15 months. Prior to that, he was connected with the Capone syndicate, partnering in gambling operations at the Silver Bar with Charles Gill and Ralph Pierce at 400 South State Street. The Miami Syndicate, an older gambling syndicate, has primarily headquartered its operations at Club 86. Although the club hasn't been charged with gambling activities in the last 2 years, some members still run individual horse bookmaking operations. The key members are Charles Thomas, Merle Yarbrough, Jack Friedlander, Cliff Spikes, and Marty Richman. The Sunny Isles Casino, located in Sunny Isles, is owned by Ike Miller and 3 members of the S&G syndicate from Miami Beach, Charles Friedman, Jules Levitt, and Harold Salvi. This year, George Bowers also became the owner, and some previous members have since left the Island Club, which is also located at the Sunny Isles Casino. The Island Club is operated by Herbert Mannheim, Sam Cohen, Sam Gameboy Miller of Cleveland, and Jack Friedlander. The committee. Did you mention Russell as a member of the S&G syndicate? Mr. Sullivan. Yes, I did. The committee. What were the circumstances that led to Russell becoming a member? Mr. Sullivan. In early February 1943, during the peak of the season, the wire service was suddenly cut off in Miami Beach. Over the next few days, the wire service was also shut off in the rest of South Florida, including Broward, Monroe, and Dade counties. This effectively put organized bookmaking out of business for 10 to 12 days. When the service was eventually restored, Harry Russell was brought in as a partner in the S&G syndicate. The committee. Have you described the operations of the syndicate in Miami to your satisfaction? Mr. Sullivan. I believe so. The major operations I've discussed were based at Club 86. Some operators were also connected with the Teepee, a nightclub and gambling spot located on Southwest 8th Street, which has been running off and on for several years, mostly during the season. The individual members of the syndicate have also been involved in other forms of gambling, such as bolita and numbers of rackets, but usually as individuals. This syndicate also operates under the legal name ABC Co. The committee. What types of gambling were conducted at Club 86? Mr. Sullivan. The usual games, craps, roulette, chuck-a-luck, and birdcage. It's a large gambling establishment. The committee. Do you know where the S&G syndicate gets its wire service today? Mr. Sullivan. No, I don't. The committee. But it did receive wire service during the past winter? Mr. Sullivan. Yes, it did. The committee. But you don't know where the service came from? Mr. Sullivan. No, I don't. Senator Hunt. This morning, Mr. Sullivan, you mentioned observing a significant transfer of telephone equipment from a telephone company truck to a passenger car. Was that transaction reported, or was any action taken regarding it? Mr. Sullivan. Yes, we reported it. The investigators who witnessed it submitted the report to the office of the county solicitor to determine whether there was enough evidence to prosecute. The key issue was whether they could definitively identify the equipment in the car as property of the telephone company. The county solicitor considered conducting further investigations, such as searching the car or bringing the men in for questioning to locate the equipment, but ultimately no further action was taken. Mr. Sullivan explained that the telephone company had been informed about the suspicious activities. Yes, they were apprised of it, he said. In fact, I spoke directly with the officials, and we agreed that the matter would be taken up with the county solicitor's office. And nothing came of it? Someone asked. Unfortunately, nothing came of it, he confirmed. The conversation then turned to the scale of the gambling operations. You're probably more familiar with the gambling situation here than anyone else. Could you give us an estimate of how much money is involved in a single season? Mr. Sullivan hesitated. It's difficult to say, but I would estimate that the gross take for the S&G syndicate on Miami Beach alone is between $30 and $40 million a year. Their net earnings are likely somewhere between $4 and $8 million annually. And that doesn't include the gambling houses or other operations? That's right. It doesn't include those. Someone pressed further, asking, can you take a guess as to the total value of all the gambling business here in a season? I would estimate that the remaining gambling in the county doesn't amount to more than what S&G makes, probably somewhere around $8 to $10 million. Mr. Sullivan replied. But what about the broader Miami area? Came the next question. Honestly, I can't say for certain, Sullivan admitted. I'm not familiar enough with all the operations in Broward County, but I know it's a significant amount of money. It could be as much as $25 million, the person suggested. Would you say that's possible? Yes, that's possible, Sullivan agreed. And in Broward County, a large portion of it would go north. In Dade County, many of the gambling concessionaires are from out of state, New York, New Jersey. So their share of the money, about 50%, leaves Florida. The other 50%, which belongs to the syndicate, stays here. But even then, a significant part of that likely leaves as well. They shifted to a broader question. Do you think gambling is an asset to this community? Sullivan shook his head. No, I don't. What about the general public? What do they think? There's definitely a group of people who believe it brings in tourists, he acknowledged. I think the average person doesn't see the harm in placing a small bet. To them, gambling is just a harmless dollar bet. They don't really understand the scale of the operations when they become highly organized and run by syndicates. The conversation then moved to the topic of local finances. Do these gamblers maintain local bank accounts? Someone asked. Yes, many of them do, Sullivan confirmed. Do you think there's any honest record of their winnings for tax purposes? No, it's too easy to take money off the top, he admitted. The chairman then interjected, addressing a different issue. You mentioned earlier that the Miami Crime Commission employs attorneys to prosecute cases. Do the regular prosecuting attorneys in Dade County ever go after these gambling operations? Rarely, Sullivan said. Most significant gambling operations aren't prosecuted. Have you provided information to them? What happens when you do? The operations of these gambling places are well known. It's practically public knowledge that certain gambling establishments are running wide open, he explained. It's not like they're operating in secret. Everyone knows where they are, and different places cater to different types of clienteles. The more upscale places have a wealthier crowd. But what's the local prosecuting attorney doing to shut them down? Someone asked. There hasn't been any substantial action, Sullivan said plainly. No action at all? Not that I'm aware of. And what about the sheriff? What's his responsibility in this? The sheriff has a responsibility to enforce the law, Sullivan replied. It's illegal to operate open gambling places in Florida, right? Yes, it is, Sullivan confirmed. So what does the sheriff do about it? Not much particularly, he admitted. Why not? Don't you give him information about these operations? The information is already out there. Everyone knows about it, Sullivan said. Has the sheriff shut down any of these operations recently? Occasionally, yes. They tend to shut down when something significant happens, he explained. For instance, the governor was here in February. After he went back to Tallahassee, he urged all the sheriffs to enforce the gambling laws, and everything closed down. For how long? They stayed closed for the rest of the season. That was around mid-February. The discussion then turned to possible federal solutions. What kind of federal legislation do you think would help local law enforcement or state prosecutors with the problems you're facing here? Sullivan paused, considering the question. I think, first of all, there needs to be much stricter enforcement of the income tax laws. If the current laws were enforced as they should be, it would put a lot of these people behind bars. There also needs to be some kind of control over the transmission of gambling and racetrack information without making it feel like censorship. And we need to think about how we can regulate the transportation of gambling profits across state lines, as well as how they're invested in other states. He went on, the reality is that a huge amount of money flows into the gambling racket here, and that influences elections. Candidates need massive amounts of money to run for office, and the only people who seem willing to invest are those involved in the rackets. It's very hard for a legitimate businessman to compete. That's why the goodwill of the racket operators becomes so valuable to candidates. Sullivan sighed. I think it's more pronounced here than in other places, simply because of the sheer amount of money involved in gambling. The conversation continued with a reflection on the challenges honest candidates face. I know there are a good number of honest public officials in this area, someone said, referring to earlier points Mr. Sullivan had made. That's right, Sullivan agreed. I don't mean every candidate takes money from the rackets, but if someone is considering running for office, they have to weigh whether they can realistically do so without the financial backing that their competitors, who may accept money from these rackets, will have. As a result of the work of the Crime Commission, and with more officials and citizens becoming aware of the scale of corruption, do you think people are starting to wake up and take responsibility for this problem? Someone asked. I do, Sullivan replied. There's definitely a greater civic consciousness today than there was a year and a half ago. It's much stronger now. Senator Hunt then jumped in. Mr. Sullivan, we've seen evidence that local gamblers have made large and frequent donations to local charities. These organizations seem to accept this blood money without question. Don't you think it would be better for the community if they refuse to take contributions from gamblers? After all, when these gamblers make such contributions, they know exactly what they're doing. They're buying public opinion. Sullivan nodded. That's absolutely true. These donations run into large sums of money. Of course, for gamblers, it's part of public relations and can often be written off as a deductible item. But the effect on the community is significant. These organizations and their members start to see the gamblers as good people, because they're supporting charitable causes. It leaves the public with a false impression of these individuals. He paused before continuing. And, of course, it doesn't stop with charity. A lot of that money is also invested in political candidates, which has a direct effect on the community. Candidates who accept these funds may end up indebted to the wrong people. The conversation then turned to the next witness, S.M. Perkins, an auditor from Coral Gables, who was brought in to discuss financial records. "I'm in the public bookkeeping and income tax business," Perkins explained. "I've been subpoenaed to produce certain records, but I only have documents related to Charles Friedman and his brother Sam, who are connected with the S&G syndicate." "Tell us about your work with Charles Friedman," Perkins was asked. "I keep the nightclub books for him and his personal accounts," Perkins responded. "And what about Sam Friedman?" "He's Charles's brother and business partner, so I do the same for him." Perkins then confirmed that he had brought the relevant books and records with him. "The books are in the back of the room, along with the cancelled checks. I've been working with Charlie and Sam for about 15 years. The chairman inquired about the completeness of the documents. "Mr. Perkins, are these all the books and records you have related to Charles Friedman?" "I believe so," Perkins answered. "These are all the documents I have on Charlie's Inn, their nightclub." The chairman mentioned that they might want to see the 1950 checks as well. Perkins responded, "You can get them in 20 minutes if you need them." "We'll go over them with you tomorrow," the chairman said. Perkins agreed, noting that he had payroll work that afternoon but could bring the documents the next day. Discussion moved to the income tax returns. "Do you have copies of the tax returns and worksheets?" Perkins was asked. "I don't have them with me. The files are with two accountants, Joseph A. Post and Bloomin and Roberts," Perkins explained. The chairman confirmed, "You can get the income tax returns, though?" "Yes. I can bring them tomorrow morning," Perkins replied. The conversation then shifted to Attorney General Richard Irvin, who was called and sworn in. Senator Kefauver greeted him, and they exchanged pleasantries before diving into the matter at hand. "Mr. Irvin, do you have members of your staff with you?" "I have Mr. Gask and Mr. Tony here, and Mr. Horton will be joining us soon. He had a court hearing but will be here shortly," Irvin replied. Senator Kefauver then asked, "As Attorney General of Florida, are you familiar with the race wire service that's been operating in the state for several years?" "Yes, I am," Irvin responded. Mr. Halley chimed in. "You testified about it at a previous hearing, correct?" "Yes, I did," Irvin confirmed. "That was during a subcommittee hearing, and Senator Hunt was present. Since this committee has jurisdiction over organized crime operating through interstate commerce, would you mind explaining Section 550.07 of the Florida statutes regarding campaign contributions?" Halley asked. Irvin explained, "This statute makes it illegal for any racetrack to contribute to the campaign of any political party or candidate for state, county, or municipal office. If it's found that such contributions have been made, the Racing Commission can revoke the track's license or permit." Halley asked, "Is this prohibition limited to racetracks, or does it also apply to individuals connected with racetracks, like officers or stockholders?" "It applies to anyone connected with the track," Irvin clarified. "Is there a penal provision for violations of this statute?" Halley inquired. "I don't believe there's a penal provision," Irvin replied. "The punishment comes in the form of revoking the track's permit." The discussion then moved to Section 365.02, a law related to railroads and regulated utilities. "That's the 1949 law that banned wire service to bookmakers," Irvin explained. "Before that law, the Florida Railroad and Public Utilities Commission had no authority to cancel private or leased wires that were being used for bookmaking purposes. That law really set things in motion to shut down wire service to bookmakers." Irvin added, "It wasn't until people in Miami and others who wanted this bookie bill enacted started pushing for it that state officials, aside from the governor, started seriously considering stepping into local law enforcement matters. We thought it was a local problem for years. Irvin reflected on his own experiences. When I was campaigning, I came down to this community and saw the problem firsthand. We thought it was a local issue, but once the law was put on the books, I was immediately named as a defendant in a lawsuit to have it declared unconstitutional. Fortunately, the Florida Supreme Court upheld the law. Mr. Irvin began by providing a timeline. The Florida Supreme Court upheld the wire service law on December 19, 1949. The legislature had passed the law earlier that year in May. After the court ruling, we worked with the Utilities Commission, and they pointed out that all the contracts for private wire services passed through my office for investigation. It was my duty to review these contracts and determine whether they were legal or illegal. He continued, explaining how his office took action. As part of that responsibility, I set up an investigative division. I appointed Assistant Attorney General Tony, and we brought on Mr. Gaske, who had been an investigator for several past governors. They were tasked with looking into the wire service contracts. Irvin described how shutting down the Western Union service was straightforward. There wasn't much trouble shutting off the wire service provided by Western Union. It was a notorious contract, with around 140 drops in South Florida alone. After the Railroad Commission cancelled the Western Union wire service contract, which was part of the Continental Press Service, and other services like Hagerty Interstate and the News Service, the bookmakers quickly adapted. They switched to using long-distance telephones. He noted, "We believe Continental Press Service is a national wire service. They use any means possible, telephone, telegraph, to get the information. We've started proceedings to cut off the telephones too. It's our duty, and we're doing the best we can, working with local law enforcement, the Crime Commission, and others." Reflecting on his role, Irvin said, "When I ran for office, I didn't fully understand what I was getting into. I thought I'd be in Tallahassee as the state's lawyer, not involved in local law enforcement. This law has opened our eyes. We're in it now, and I commend this committee for recognizing how long these conditions have persisted." He added, "People here don't realize how much the nation is undergoing a moral reawakening, and even though we can't stop all crime, we're making an effort. The newspapers, the Crime Commission, good citizens of Miami, they're all joining this effort, but we need help from the federal government." Addressing federal involvement, Irvin noted, "Some people think it's wrong for the federal government to step into local law enforcement. But the truth is that this wire network and those involved are encroaching on us. We need the federal government's help. I think the bill your committee is working on is good, but I hope it goes further. I wish it could shut off both the rapid results as well as the betting information. I also think legitimate news organizations should help us." He emphasized the need for education, saying, "It's about educating people. Many of our law enforcement officers are honest and dedicated, and they understand that the state, and now the federal government, means business. With the support of federal agencies like the Crime Commission and the FBI, I believe we'll make real progress." The conversation then turned back to the wire service in Miami Beach. "Mr. Irvin," someone asked, "was the wire service discontinued in Miami Beach in early 1949? "It may have been," Irvin replied, "but if it was, it wasn't due to any action from my office or anyone in Tallahassee. The telegraph wire service was cut off in December 1949, but I've heard testimony from Mr. Sullivan suggesting it may have been cut off earlier due to a disagreement among those involved. However, I don't think anyone in my office had anything to do with it." "But now," the questioner continued, "you recognize that it's a serious issue, affecting the entire state." "Yes, we do," Irvin confirmed. "Our legislature has recognized this as an evil. The law only passed after 2 scandals. They tried to pass it in 1948, but it didn't go through until 1949, following a bribery scandal that brought everything to light. That played a major role in its passage. Mr. Halley added, "I believe you've stated that bookmaking and gambling are dominated by syndicates, involving people so powerful they can bribe and influence public officials." "That's true," Irvin said firmly. "The profit motive is so enormous that these people naturally protect their investments. If they can bribe or buy someone, they will." At this point, Senator Hunt spoke up, praising Irvin's remarks. "I'd like to compliment the Attorney General for his statement about the effect this racket has on the community's morals and economy. From what I've observed, when a candidate runs for office on a platform of clean law enforcement and sticks to that, they generally win." Irvin nodded. "Senator, I hope so." The chairman asked for clarification. "Mr. Irvin, let me get this straight. Before the passage of the Wire Act, the wire services were operating freely, sending race results out so any bookie could get them without any restraint." "Yes," Irvin confirmed. "And the Wire Act prevents the intrastate use of wire services, correct?" the chairman continued. "That is true," Irvin responded. "After the Act was passed, didn't you face challenges with information being sent to out-of-state locations and then returning via the Continental Wire Service?" the chairman pressed. "We did," Irvin acknowledged. "The information came back." "And did you feel that was beyond your jurisdiction because it was an interstate transaction?" the chairman asked. "Yes, I felt there was nothing we could do about it," Irvin admitted. "There's no way to address that unless we get federal legislation. Even if legitimate news services cooperate and delay the information, anyone can call places like Valdosta, Georgia, or New Orleans, Louisiana, to get the race results from a subscriber on Associated Press or Continental Press lines. This system of obtaining information is so widespread that all it takes is a long-distance call." He elaborated, "In a raid in Jacksonville a few days ago, we found people were calling Minneapolis, Valdosta, Augusta, and Bristol to get race results. You've examined the state's police power to handle these transactions and determined you can't interfere with interstate communications, correct?" the chairman asked. "That's right," Irvin confirmed. The chairman then shifted to the legal challenges against the Wire Act. Who brought the lawsuit to test the constitutionality of the law? Walter Haggerty, John McHenry, a corporation called Interstate News Service, and H.E. Bilson from Radio Program Service, Irvin explained. "How has the telephone company in Florida cooperated with your efforts to stop people from using phones to immediately relay race information?" the chairman asked. Irvin explained, "We're getting better cooperation as we move forward. Initially, they didn't want to provide us with information about the telephones or let us check on phones suspected to be used by bookmakers. But after they saw we were serious, they began allowing us to check toll records and provide information when we identified a phone. They didn't want to get involved in law enforcement, but things have improved in recent months." The chairman followed up, "Can you or your deputies share any examples of strange phone setups near racetracks in Florida?" Assistant Attorney General James Toney took over. "One typical setup was at Sunshine Park, where there was a small shack with a turret on top. The turret had a clear view of the turf board, and the operators used binoculars to read the race results. They had telephone connections in the shack. We found 2 men there who claimed to be employees of Continental Press Service." "Can you provide their names for the record?" the chairman asked. "Yes," Toney replied. "One of them was Alfred Olson." "Please share what you have now, and you can provide the rest later," the chairman instructed. Toney continued, "That location was part of the Continental Wire Circuit before Western Union cancelled its service. We found the fuse box for the wire service there, and similar installations were around Tropical Park, Hialeah, and Gulfstream, where there were drops from the old Continental race wire line. Did you find people working for Continental at those other locations too? The chairman asked. No, we couldn't catch them at the other sites, but they were operating in those areas, Tony said. They had moved their lookouts and set up phone connections in different spots. The chairman thanked Tony and turned to Assistant Attorney General Mallory Horton. Mr. Horton, can you tell us about your knowledge of the wire service changes? Horton explained. Up until December 1949, Western Union operated a circuit connected to the radio program service, based in the Muncie Building in Baltimore, Maryland. This service had a connection with the Intrastate News Service, which originated in Jacksonville, Florida. H.E. Bilson was the manager of radio program service, and their contracts tied them directly to the Florida wire service. He added, when the wire circuits were cut, people who wanted the race information turned to telephones. During our investigation, we found that the drops previously on the Intrastate News Circuit were now calling the same Baltimore group via telephone. McBride, in a case involving Western Union in California, admitted he was a supplier of race information to this group in Baltimore. Horton further explained the nationwide network. There's a clear connection between the radio program service in Baltimore and these bookmakers. In fact, the Florida contacts now call either New Orleans, Baltimore, or Chicago directly. In our investigation, we found numerous direct calls to Continental Press Service in Chicago. Horton concluded, that's what we've uncovered so far, that I believe would be of interest to the committee. Mr. Horton was asked whether he had copies of the contracts and documents relevant to the wire service investigations that could be turned over to the committee. He responded, these are the only copies I have, but I'll be glad to make some copies and furnish them to the committee. The chairman appreciated the offer and then asked, do you, as a specialist in this field, agree with the Attorney General's recommendation that there needs to be federal control over communications to prevent this information from being used for gambling? Horton was firm in his response. Senator, I'm convinced that the federal government must supplement state authority beyond its borders. We have no jurisdiction over calls that cross state lines, and the only way to stop this practice is through federal legislation. The conversation then shifted to W.H. Buddy Gask, an investigator for the Attorney General's office. Mr. Halley began questioning him. Mr. Gask, were you present in court when Dan Sullivan testified? Yes, sir, I was, Gask replied. You may recall that one of the people he testified about was Samuel Bratt, who was involved in operations at the Colonial Inn and Greenacres. Do you know Mr. Bratt? Yes, sir, Gask confirmed. Halley continued, have you had any dealings with him? No, sir, Gask answered, before adding, but I'll be glad to describe my knowledge of Mr. Bratt. He began explaining, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was introduced to Mr. Bratt by his attorney, Senator John E. Matthews from Jacksonville, who is also my senator. It happened in the halls of the legislature in Tallahassee. Since then, I've encountered Mr. Bratt through my work in South Florida, both during my time in the governor's office and more recently in the Attorney General's office. Gask explained further, I've gone to Mr. Bratt for information because I knew he had connections to the wire service. He was always gracious in providing information on people I was checking on. Sometimes he even called me long distance from his home to give me updates. On a few occasions, he would leave messages for me to pass along to his attorney, Senator Matthews. Gask then added a personal note. In 1947, I had the misfortune of developing cancer in my eye, and I spent several months in hospitals. During that time, Mr. Bratt called to check on me and inquired with my wife about how I was doing. Returning to business matters, Gask clarified, I want to make it clear that I've never had any business dealings with Mr. Bratt, just as I haven't had any with Costello, Erickson, or any of the other figures involved in these investigations. My relationship with Mr. Bratt was strictly professional, gathering information from him when necessary. Halley then asked, in early 1950, when you were conducting investigations in the Miami area, were you staying at the El Comodoro Hotel? Yes, sir, Gasker confirmed. And during that time, did you receive a number of telephone calls from Mr. Bratt? I wouldn't say a number, but he did call several times to reach Mr. Tony and myself, Gasker responded. Halley pressed further. Do you recall if Mr. Bratt called as often as 4 times in a single day? I don't recall specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did, Gasker said. Do you remember the subject of those calls? Halley asked. Gasker explained. He was giving us information that we had asked him to check on, specifically about bookmaking in Broward County, where we were working to clean up the area. Halley followed up. Did you make any memoranda or official records of that information? No, sir. I just made notes and kept them in my pocket, Gask admitted. So, you never filed official reports about the information you got from Mr. Bratt? Halley asked. That's correct, Gask said. With no further questions for Gask, the chairman shifted back to Mr. Irvin. Mr. Irvin, there's one more question I'd like to ask. Where does the responsibility for prosecuting criminal violations under state law rest here in Dade and Broward counties? Irvin provided a detailed response. Senator, there's a Supreme Court decision on this from a case brought by my predecessor, Mr. Watson. The court ruled that there's a clear line of demarcation between the duties of the Attorney General and the state attorneys. The state attorneys and county solicitors have the discretion to decide whether or not to prosecute local law violations. They are elected officials, and it's their responsibility to determine if prosecution is warranted based on the facts. He added, Our office assists them when requested. We handle criminal appeals, and if they ask us to brief a legal question, we do it. But we have no control over their discretion to prosecute. The chairman pressed further. So, even if the law is being flagrantly violated, you have no authority to intervene? That's correct, Senator. I cannot override their discretion on whether to prosecute. If we receive a complaint about a local law violation, we refer it to the state attorney or county solicitor and ask them to investigate and decide whether prosecution is appropriate, Irvin explained. Mr. Irvin continued, explaining, We've done what we could regarding this crime situation, Senator, but I don't recall transmitting any specific requests for prosecution to the officials in Broward or Dade County, though we did consult with them about prosecuting these cases. For example, where we made a raid and found someone. The chairman interrupted. Of course, Mr. Irvin. All you need to do is read the newspapers to know what's going on here. That's true, Irvin conceded. Whose responsibility is it to prosecute locally, then? The chairman asked. It's the responsibility of the local prosecution office, Irvin replied. And do you know why it hasn't been done? The chairman pressed. I believe it stems from the local customs here, Irvin explained. There has been a so-called liberal policy in this area, and they didn't want to crack down on certain types of gambling. I suppose much of it grew out of that. At this point, Mr. Horton, another official, stepped in to offer more details. Senator, if I may make an observation on behalf of Attorney General Irvin, Horton said, we have signed affidavits related to the bookmaking operations in Dade and Broward counties. Some of these cases, as far as I know, are under prosecution now. We've brought these violations to the attention of local law enforcement officers, and complaints have been filed. The chairman asked, What complaints have been filed, Mr. Horton? Do you know? Horton responded, Yes, sir. Specifically, a search warrant and arrest warrant were issued against a bookmaking operation at the Saxony Hotel in Miami Beach. That was based on information we obtained through local law enforcement. And the Sheriff's Office of Dade County served the warrant. Arrests and charges were made against those found in the bookmaking establishment. The chairman pushed further. What about the owners of these bookmaking establishments? The big boys like the S&G Syndicate and the Ericssons, the ones we've seen on the charts here. They're conspicuous by their absence, Horton admitted. They usually have their lieutenants or employees running the operations, making it difficult to catch them in the act. The chairman asked, does Florida have a conspiracy law making it illegal to conspire to violate a criminal law? Yes, we do, Horton replied. The chairman followed up. If these big operators are putting up the finances, keeping the books, or otherwise supporting the operation, wouldn't that be part of the conspiracy? It would be, if we could get positive evidence of their involvement, Horton said. But as Attorney General Irvin pointed out, the Attorney General's office is hesitant to overstep the authority of local law enforcement unless specifically requested. Frustrated, the chairman noted, it's not particularly our problem, but we've got a truckload of books and records back here. We had no trouble getting them. I want to know why nobody has done anything with them. Mr. Irvin responded, Senator, I don't have the authority to prosecute. I can't come in and take over local cases. Where we've found violations, we've turned everything over to the local law enforcement officers for prosecution. They've cooperated to some extent, but the prosecuting officials tend to wait for the sheriff to work up the case before taking any action. The chairman clarified, it wasn't my intention to lecture anyone about their duty. It's just a matter of inquiry. At this point, Mr. Gasker, the investigator, added his perspective. Senator, may I say a word? The biggest problem we face is what happens after we arrest someone. For instance, we arrested a notorious bookmaker running a gambling house in Hollywood, the Valhalla Club. He had a bookmaking establishment, roulette, and other equipment. When we went to trial in Fort Lauderdale, his lawyer pled nolle contendere without informing the Attorney General's office. The judge fined him $500 without ever hearing the full case. Gask went on. We had a similar case in Jacksonville. Mr. Tony and I raided a big gambling joint, and we made sure to stay with the constable so the suspects wouldn't be tipped off. We arrested 3 notorious bookmakers. But the justice of the peace initially set their bond at $100, even though it's a felony. I went to the justice the next morning and explained how serious the bookmaking law is, and she agreed to raise the bond to $500 apiece. But $500 is nothing to these people. They don't mind posting that kind of bond. The chairman asked, do these people skip their bonds? In many cases, yes, Gasker confirmed. There was one case in Fort Lauderdale where the suspect never showed up for trial. He forfeited the bond, but it was only $100. The chairman concluded, Thank you, Mr. Irvin. Thank you, Mr. Tony. Before moving on, Mr. Tony provided additional information. Senator, the 2 names you asked about were Alfred Olson and Oppenheim. Olson's address is the Miami Flagler Hotel. The chairman confirmed, and you established they were employed by the Continental Press Service of Chicago. That was their statement, Tony replied. Do you have their signed statements? The chairman asked. No, sir, Tony admitted. Mr. Irvin, upon invitation, joined the committee again for further discussion. The chairman turned to a new line of inquiry, asking, Mr. Irvin, we forgot to ask about Florida's laws regarding campaign expenditures for candidates. Specifically, what are the limits for state offices? Irvin responded, Senator, the law that set a ceiling on campaign expenditures was repealed in 1949. So, as of now, there's no limit on the amount of money candidates can spend. The chairman probed further. But the current law still requires a full listing of all contributions, correct? Yes, it does, Irvin confirmed. The chairman inquired about the previous laws. What was the law prior to the repeal in 1949? And Is that law retroactive? Irvin replied, "The old law is not retroactive, and those of us who ran in 1948 are still subject to it. The law applied to both primary campaigns and general elections." The chairman wanted more specifics. What were the limits in 1948? Irvin said he wasn't sure of the exact figures, but mentioned, "I believe it was $5,000 for certain offices like cabinet officials and maybe $10,000 or $12,000 for the governor. I'll check on that for you." Did the old law require a listing of contributions as well? The chairman asked. Yes, candidates had to file a return listing their contributions with the Secretary of State's office in Tallahassee, Irvin confirmed. Curious about the repeal, the chairman asked, "Why was the law repealed? Who was behind it?" As I recall, it was sponsored by the House Committee on Elections. The reason given was that people were ignoring the spending limits, making liars out of candidates, and they thought it was hypocritical to keep the law, Irvin explained. The chairman pressed for more details. Who sponsored the bill in the House and Senate? I'll get that information for you, Senator. I'll need to make a call to check, Irvin promised. The chairman also asked, was there any fight against repealing the law? No, I don't think so. It passed unanimously, Irvin said. Do you know if the governor recommended the repeal? The chairman queried. I don't believe he did, but I can't say for sure, Irvin responded. Finally, the chairman asked, who is responsible for maintaining the state election records of contributions? That would be R.A. Gray, the Secretary of State, Irvin answered. Senator Hunt then joined the discussion. How long has he been Secretary of State? He asked. He's going into his 20th year, Irvin replied. Next, the committee called R.W. Howden to testify, and Mr. Halley began his questioning. Mr. Howden, what's your address? Halley asked. 1428 Northwest 32nd Street, Howden replied. And where are you currently employed? I'm an investigator with the Equitable Life Assurance Society. I've been there for a year, as of June 16th. Halley asked about Howden's previous work. Where were you employed between 1943 and 1949? I worked for the Dade County Sheriff's Office, Howden said. And under what circumstances did you leave the Sheriff's Office? I was dissatisfied with the circumstances there, and I had the chance for a better position, Howden explained. Was that better position with Equitable Life Assurance? Halley asked. Yes, sir, Howden confirmed. Halley then turned to Howden's previous roles. What positions did you hold in the Dade County Sheriff's Office? I was in charge of the Identification Bureau from 1945 to 1947, and then I was an assistant homicide investigator, Howden responded. In 1949, were you considering an offer for a job as chief of police somewhere? Halley asked. Yes, sir, at Opa-locka, Florida, Howden replied. The questioning then shifted to a conversation Howden had with Tom Burke, a deputy sheriff involved in the gambling squad. Did you have a conversation with Mr. Burke about your potential job at Opa-locka? Yes, sir, I did, Howden confirmed. Halley asked him to describe the conversation in detail. Howden recounted, It was about 2 weeks before I was supposed to start at Opa-locka. Burke pulled me aside and told me that if I was going to take the job, I should see a man who would take care of any gambling situations or payoffs that might arise. Did he tell you that this man would ensure you got a cut of the gambling at Opa-locka? Halley asked directly. Yes, sir, he did, Howden responded. Halley then asked if there was any further conversation. Howden explained, that was it. He told me the man's name was Red Rainwater. I didn't care about the offer, so I just left it at that. Can you identify Mr. Rainwater? Halley asked. I don't know him personally. I wouldn't recognize him if I saw him, Howden admitted. Mr. Howden was asked if he had a conversation with a man named George Troskoff. He confirmed, "Yes, sir. George Troskoff is a deputy constable in the 1st District of Dade County. I received a telephone call from him one evening. Actually, it was the same day I spoke with Mr. Burke. Troskoff told me he had $200 for me to take a vacation before I went to Opa Loca. I asked him what it was for, and he said that Red Rainwater had sent it. I told him I wasn't interested in anything he had to offer and made it clear that if I took the position of Chief of Police in Opa Loca, they would know I was the chief." When asked if he ever took the position of Chief of Police, Howden responded, "No, sir. Before the time came for me to take the job, I accepted the position I currently hold." The questioning continued regarding further conversations with Burke, Troskoff, or Rainwater about the police chief position. Howden said, "I had no further conversations with Rainwater and none with Burke or Troskoff after that." When asked when he last spoke to Tom Burke, Howden recalled, "It was about 2 or 3 weeks ago near the courthouse." He was then asked to recount that conversation. "I met Mr. Burke on the street. We exchanged pleasantries, and I asked him what he thought about the situation developing in the courthouse. He said he wasn't mad at the sheriff, Jimmy Sullivan, but he complained that the sheriff's wife had accused him of walking around with large sums of money. Burke told me that he had turned over amounts like $7,000, $8,000, $10,000, and $11,000 at a time, and that Mrs. Sullivan had signed receipts for the money." "Was he talking about cash?" the committee asked. "Yes, sir," Howden confirmed. The committee pressed further, asking, "Did he say that Mrs. Sullivan signed receipts for this money?" "Yes, sir," Howden confirmed again. Howden was asked if there was any more conversation. He responded, "No, that was about it. We just passed the time of day." The committee then asked if Howden had ever discussed payoff money with Burke. He recalled, "One afternoon, as we were leaving the courthouse, Burke seemed upset. I believe the sheriff had reprimanded him about a new car he had bought. While getting on the elevator, I joked that he'd better be careful, or the crime commission would get after him. Burke responded that he didn't care about the crime commission, that he made his and had taken care of the man with the whiskers, and that the rest could go to the devil." "Did Burke ever explicitly admit to being in on the take?" the committee asked. "In so many words, yes," Howden confirmed. The committee asked, "Was it understood between you that being in on the take meant receiving bribe money from gamblers?" "I think that was pretty general knowledge around the courthouse," Howden said. The committee then asked if there was anything else Howden wanted to share about bribe money or the sheriff's office. "No, sir," he replied. The chairman then clarified, "You were brought here under subpoena, correct?" "Yes, sir," Howden affirmed. "You didn't volunteer to testify?" the chairman asked. "No, sir," Howden responded. "And you've been offered no inducement to testify?" "None whatsoever," Howden stated. The chairman then asked some clarifying questions. "Where is Opaloka located?" "It's about 18 miles from the courthouse, just north of the Miami Naval Air Station," Howden explained. "And it's in Dade County?" "Yes, sir," Howden confirmed. The chairman inquired further, "Who is Red Rainwater?" "He's a local gambler involved in numbers and slot machines," Howden replied. "Does he have a reputation as a well-known gambler?" the chairman asked. "Yes, sir," Howden confirmed. Senator Hunt had no further questions, and the chairman thanked Howden. Next, Tom Burke was sworn in and questioned by Senator Kefauver. Burke confirmed that he had been subpoenaed and understood that he was testifying under oath. Mr. Halley then took over the questioning. "Did you hear the testimony of the last witness, Mr. Howden?" "I did," Burke confirmed. "And you know Mr. Howden from working with him, correct?" "Yes, sir," Burke acknowledged. "Did you work together in the sheriff's office?" "Yes, in the same department," Burke confirmed. Halley asked, "Was Howden attached to your gambling squad?" Now and then he would go out, but that wasn't his principal duty, Burke explained. What was your principal duty in the sheriff's office? Halley asked. I took care of the criminal court of record, served papers, and in the meantime made arrests for operating gambling houses, Burke responded. Halley then asked, Do you want to comment on Mr. Howden's testimony? In other words, it's false, Burke stated. Halley pressed further. Did you have a conversation with Mr. Howden about 2 weeks ago? I did, Burke confirmed. Where did you meet him? Halley asked. Near a parking lot on Northwest 1st Street, just west of the railroad tracks, Burke explained. And what did you two talk about? Halley asked. Burke recounted, We greeted each other and he asked me how I was doing. I told him I was doing all right, and he asked how things were going on the farm. I asked him what he was up to, and he said he was still working for the insurance people. He mentioned he had seen George the Greek, who used to work in the sheriff's office. He told me that when he spoke to George, he was joking around, but George responded that he didn't care what they had on him. Halley continued, Is it true, as alleged by Mr. Howden, that you gave large sums of cash, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000, and $11,000, to Mrs. Jimmy Sullivan? That is false, Burke stated firmly. The questioning of Tom Burke continued, focusing on allegations about payments to the sheriff and gambling activities. Have you ever given any sums of money in cash to Mrs. Jimmy Sullivan? Burke was asked. No, sir, which is false, he replied. Have you ever given any sums of money to Sheriff Jimmy Sullivan? No, sir, which is false, Burke reiterated. The line of questioning then moved to the conversation Burke had with Mr. Howden in 1949 regarding Howden's potential position as Chief of Police in Opa-locka. Burke admitted, Yes, sir, we had a few words. He told me, Tom, I got a break. I believe I'm going to Opa-locka as Chief of Police. I said, That's a nice community. Why don't you go out there? Was a man named Red Rainwater mentioned during that conversation? Not by me, Burke stated. Was he mentioned by R.W. Howden? Burke was asked. No, sir, he responded. The questioning then shifted to Red Rainwater. Have you ever read about him in the newspapers? Yes, sir, Burke said. Do you know who he is? I could pick him out of a crowd, yes. I arrested him twice. Was it an error when I first asked if you had heard of Red Rainwater and you said, No, sir? There are two of them, Burke clarified. Which one haven't you heard of? The committee inquired. One I don't know, Burke answered. The committee pressed further, asking, Do you remember telling Howden you would fix him up with a cut of the gambling in Opa-locka? No, sir, I never told him that, Burke responded. The committee continued. What is Red Rainwater's business in Opa-locka? I wouldn't know, sir, Burke replied. Is he in the gambling business? I wouldn't know, sir, Burke answered. Even by reputation? No, sir, Burke said. You arrested him twice, in Miami, correct? Yes, in the city of Miami, Burke confirmed. And what did you arrest him for in Miami? Operating a gambling house, Burke explained. What is his business in Miami? I believe he is in the business of chartering books, Burke said. The conversation returned to Burke's involvement in gambling cases. You saw him operating a gambling establishment on 2 occasions? I didn't see him gambling, but I arrested him, Burke replied. Did you ever tell anybody that you were in on the take? Take of what? Burke asked. A bribe, the committee clarified. No, sir, Burke answered firmly. The committee then asked about Burke's personal finances. When did you enter the sheriff's office? January 1st, 1944, Burke said. What had you been doing previously? Since August 1949, I've been on a farm, Burke explained, adding that he left the sheriff's office in 1949. Did you purchase the farm? The committee asked. Yes, sir, with mortgages, Burke responded. The committee asked about the price. What was the purchase price of the farm? $26,725, Burke answered. How much of that did you pay in cash? I paid $5,000, Burke confirmed. So you operate the farm now? Yes, sir, Burke said, explaining that he works on the farm, planting tomatoes, pears, and mangoes. The committee probed his income from the farm. What was the amount of money you earned on the farm last year? In 1949, I paid $1,069 in income tax, Burke replied. Was that income from the farm? Not all from the farm, no, sir, Burke admitted. What was the remainder of that income? The committee asked. I made about $4,100 from gambling at the Hialeah racetrack, Burke stated. The committee pressed further. What kind of gambling? At the Hialeah racetrack. I went there in January, made a couple of bets and collected, Burke explained. How much did you make from those bets? I got about $2,600 from one bet, Burke said. And you declared these profits on your income tax returns? The committee asked. Yes, sir, Burke confirmed. The committee then questioned whether Burke had ever taken bribe money, but reported it as gambling winnings. Burke denied this, stating, No, sir. They also asked if he had declared racetrack winnings in previous years. Burke responded, Yes, in 1947 and 1948, I declared small amounts, maybe about $900 or $400. The questioning continued, focusing on Burke's finances, assets, and his relationship with Bill Crosby. The committee asked, Have you declared any other racetrack winnings in previous years? No, sir, Burke responded. They pressed further. What did you win the $2,600 on? Burke hesitated. I wouldn't know the horse's name. You go by numbers. You have no idea of the horse's name? They inquired. 3 or 4 horses, Burke replied vaguely. Do you remember the name of the jockey who made that money for you? The committee asked. No, sir, Burke admitted. The committee questioned, Just a complete blank? Yes, sir, Burke confirmed. How often have you won the $2,600 on horse racing? This was the first time, Burke stated. Never before in your life? The committee pressed. No, sir. In fact, I was never much into placing bets on the horses, Burke explained. The committee moved to his property holdings, asking, Do you own any other property in addition to the farm you described? Yes, sir, Burke confirmed. Will you state what it is? I own a home, Burke said. And where is that home? It's located at 2497 21st Terrace in the city of Miami-Dade County, Burke responded. When did you purchase the home? In 1946, Burke said. The committee clarified. That was 2 years after you joined the sheriff's office? Yes, Burke confirmed. And what did you pay for that home? I paid $8,000 down, Burke explained. So you paid $8,000 in cash? The committee asked. Correct, Burke confirmed. And what was the total cost of the home? $11,000, Burke said. Do you own any other property? The committee asked. No, sir, Burke replied. Are you married? Yes, sir, Burke confirmed. Does your wife own any property? No, sir. Do you have any children? No, sir, Burke responded. The committee shifted to his finances, asking, Do you have any bank accounts? In 1949, yes, sir, Burke replied. How much did you have in the bank at the beginning of 1949? Nothing, Burke said. The committee inquired further. Will you state how much you had in the bank during any time in 1949? What was the maximum amount? Probably $3,000, Burke responded. And where did you get that $3,000? From checks from the Grove. Burke explained, referring to his farm. And this was from the sale of fruit? That's correct, Burke confirmed. Up to that point, did you have a bank account? No, sir, Burke admitted. The committee asked, how did you pay for the house when you put $8,000 down? I had saved that money. I'd been in the city of Miami, Dade County, for 30 years and was never out of employment. That was my savings, Burke explained. Where did you keep your savings? In a box? In the house, yes, in a tin box, Burke admitted. The committee pressed further. Where did you keep the $8,000? In the house, Burke reiterated. And where did you keep the $3,000 you used to buy the farm? I didn't make that until 1949, Burke explained. How did you make that $3,000? The committee asked. I had $1,000 from the racetrack and a note for $4,000, which is still pending, Burke said. How did you get the note for $4,000? The committee asked. My sister-in-law loaned me the money, Burke explained. And that was not your money. No, sir, Burke clarified. Did you repay your sister-in-law? The committee inquired. I've repaid her $500 so far, Burke said. And you did that by check? Yes, sir, Burke confirmed. I thought you had no checking account, the committee pressed. That came after August 1949, Burke explained, saying he opened a checking account after receiving profits from his farm. The committee asked, are we to assume that the $8,000 you accumulated to buy your house in 1946 was in cash? Yes, that was in cash. It was my savings, Burke confirmed. The committee then shifted focus to Burke's former employment. What was your salary as a deputy sheriff? When I first started, I earned $300 a month, and when I left, it was $350, Burke replied. And you became a deputy sheriff in 1944? Yes, on the first day of January 1944, Burke confirmed. And what was your occupation prior to becoming a deputy sheriff? I was the manager of the Police Benevolent Association of the City of Miami, Dade County, Burke explained. What was your compensation in that job? The committee asked. I don't recall exactly, but I believe it was around $35 a week, Burke said. The committee continued, how long did it take you to save the $8,000 in cash? About 18 to 20 years, Burke responded. And all that time, you kept the money in a box in your house? Yes, sir, Burke confirmed. The committee asked, do you know a man named Bill Crosby? Yes. I was introduced to Bill Crosby by the sheriff, Jimmy Sullivan. He was an investigator for the governor's office, Burke explained. What did Sheriff Sullivan tell you about Crosby? The sheriff told me, Tom, I want you to take him wherever he wants to go in Dade County, regardless of where it is. And I agreed, Burke said. Was Crosby supposed to investigate something specific, like gambling? That's what we started with, yes. He was investigating gambling, Burke confirmed. The committee asked about Burke's car. What kind of car were you driving at the time? A Chrysler, Burke responded. And how did you pay for it? I traded in my Dodge and paid a little more to the finance man, Burke said. How much did you pay in total for the Chrysler? I don't recall the exact amount, but it was over $2,000, Burke said. This is where our story comes to a close, but only for now. We'll pick Lansky's story up again in a few months in October, when Meyer Lansky himself was summoned to testify before Senator Kefauver's committee. Lansky, ever the master of discretion, kept his testimony brief. And yet, most newspapers barely covered what he had to say. Why? Because before Lansky could speak, it was Virginia Hill who took the stand, and her explosive testimony dominated the headlines. In fact, Hill's presence created such a media frenzy that it overshadowed Lansky entirely, a development that he quietly appreciated. But beneath the surface, Lansky had long viewed Virginia Hill as a dangerous liability. After the murder of her lover, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Lansky had considered eliminating Hill, seeing her as a potential threat to the secrecy of the underworld. Yet she slipped through his grasp, escaping to Paris. From there, she wrote letters to Charlie "Lucky" Luciano, who was in exile in Sicily, pleading to avoid testifying in front of the Kefauver Committee. Luciano, the mob's elder statesman, persuaded her to go through with the testimony but to stay tight-lipped, offering her access to her hidden funds in Switzerland as an incentive. Her testimony turned out to be a blessing in disguise for Lansky, as it deflected attention away from him. Yet, he never showed gratitude. He deeply disliked Hill, blaming her for Siegel's downfall. When Hill eventually passed away, Lansky didn't shed a tear. She was nothing more than a footnote in his relentless pursuit of power. Now, in 1950, Lansky's focus was squarely on expanding his empire in Havana, Cuba. Within 2 years, he would hold a government position and have diplomatic immunity. He leaned on his alliances with mobsters like Mike Miranda, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Joe Zerilli, Joe Profaci, Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Barbera, the Ciandra family, Red Levine, Jimmy Blue Eyes, Allo, and Russell Bufalino to solidify his operations there. He had the backing of the Pennsylvania crime family, the Genovese family, Phil Castell, Mo Dalitz, along with Luciano and Frank Costello, and the rising power of the Santo Trafficante Jr., who now led the Trafficante family. Trafficante Jr., more cutthroat than his father, demanded a seat at the table, a new dynamic in the Mafia's control over Havana. This tension hinted at a brewing conflict. Southern Mafia factions, led by figures like Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, eyed Cuba with hungry ambition. They didn't want to play second fiddle to Lansky or answer to Jewish gangsters. They sought their own slice of Havana's lucrative underworld and considered whether the winds of political change could favor them. Behind the scenes, weapons were quietly slipping into the hands of Fidel Castro's rebel forces in the Cuban jungles. Smugglers, including shadowy figures like Jack Ruby, were supplying arms to Castro as his revolution gained momentum. As Batista's regime wavered, the Southern Mafia started thinking ahead. They knew that if Batista fell and someone like Castro rose to power, the power dynamic in Cuba would shift, and perhaps the Southern Mafia could claim the island for themselves. Lansky's Havana empire, his last great holdout, would eventually crumble 9 years later when Castro seized control. Nearly every mobster fled Cuba, but one man stayed behind: Santo Trafficante Jr. Even as Castro's revolution swept the island, Trafficante gambled on maintaining his alliance with the new regime, hoping it would allow him to be the new dominant power player in the new Cuba. His daughter's wedding, scheduled to take place on that very island, was symbolic of the old guard's desperate hope to hold on to their stake in paradise. The stakes had never been higher, and the Mafia's grip on Cuba was slipping. This is where we leave the story for now, but the intrigue, the betrayals, and the shifting alliances will continue to unfold as we delve deeper into this web of organized crime and revolution.